So we are delighted to have the Honourable Joe Hockey with us today. Mr. Hockey had a long and distinguished career in the public service. He first entered Parliament in 1996 and spent more than 17 years on the front bench. He served as Treasurer of Australia from 2013 to 2015 and as the Ambassador of Australia to the United States from 2016 to 2020. In 2014, Mr. Hockey chaired the highly successful G20 Finance Minister and initiated major infrastructure initiatives, including the creation of the Global Infrastructure Hub, and that's why we are delighted to have you today. He launched as well the Australian Asset Recycling Program, and this program was a pioneering in the world and inspired many other governments, and that's why we are here today to learn more about it. So I would like to start by the basics and just to ask you definition of asset recycling and the difference between asset recycling and privatization, or the articulation between those two.
Well, thank you, Maud. Privatisation is actually a tool that you use to deliver asset recycling. We all know that privatisation is politically very unpopular. But if the general public sees that you're taking the value from one government-owned asset and putting it into another, which is going to deliver better infrastructure for the general community, then they're far more accepting of it. Asset recycling is essentially taking the value from a sale of an asset owned by a government, selling that asset or leasing that asset to the private sector. So the asset doesn't go away. I'm not going to pick up a toll road in Indonesia and ship it over to Australia, or take a port in Malaysia and take it over to Europe. So it'll still be there, it'll still be operational. But the value, the money the government has put into that port or into that railway is recycled into new assets. And those assets, that recycling process, it may be in addition to further private sector money, or it may be a wholly owned greenfields government initiative. It's a way of taking people through the politics and making the economics work.
Thank you very much. So can you describe the asset recycling initiative launched by the federal government in Australia in 2014? And yes, what were the conditions? Why this initiative was launched at the time?
Well, there was the macroeconomic requirement that Australia really needed to underpin new growth. So when I chaired the G20, all the finance ministers and central bankers were saying, how do we get some structural growth back in the economy? And everyone agreed that infrastructure is going to lift productivity. But how do you get that infrastructure going? And a lot of governments were saying, well, at the end of the day, it's the local governments in the cities or in the towns that are responsible for building infrastructure, running infrastructure, approving infrastructure, and also managing all of the environmental and social challenges of rolling out that infrastructure. So the question is, how do you get them to move? Because ultimately it's the federal government that has the money, but the local governments that can build it. And what I said to those local governments is, if you lease assets to the private sector and recycle the money into new infrastructure, and you do it within a set timetable, I will give you a financial benefit from the federal government that expires in 5 years' time. So I created a pot of money at the federal level of $5 billion, and I said, first in, first serve.
Yeah.
So the first local government that is going to move on leasing or selling assets and taking that money and putting it back into new infrastructure and starting the construction of that infrastructure, I'll give you a 15% bonus on anything you raise. Now, what that did was it gave them two things. Firstly, they got a 15% bonus.
Yes.
That was a one-off, and they knew it was time limited. Secondly, it gave them political air cover. So they could say, we're letting you down, our voters, we're letting you down if we don't take the opportunity to access this money, and other states and other local governments will do it and they'll beat us. So I created some competitive tension between local governments, and that really worked.
Yeah, there was a strong incentive because this incentive was really given when they actually
started it. When they
started it and invest the money to the new infrastructure, and not just when they actually divested the first asset, because they had to create this list of pipeline, and then from this list of pipeline to select some assets to, and that's where the New South Wales government were really organized to put this list of potential divested assets from in energy sector, in the transport sector, and they did very well in a very short period of time. So why New South Wales was so successful? What type of assets? Why?
Well, the irony was that it was the most left-wing anti-privatisation government in Australia that was the first to sign up. I let them decide what the infrastructure was. I let them decide what they were going to sell or lease. And my own political party was opposed to what they were doing at a local government level. But I signed up with them, and it was the government in Canberra, in the ACT, the local Canberra government, that said, we want to sell old public housing, and we want to sell our online betting program, our betting business, our wagering business, and we want to sell both those businesses and put the money into the construction of a new railway through the middle of Canberra. And I signed a deal with them that took that gave them the bonuses, and they were the first government in Australia to move. Now, my $5 billion investment created $80 to $100 billion of new infrastructure.
Yeah, that's the huge leverage effect, which is absolutely incredible. Yeah.
And I get the economic benefit nationally of new infrastructure and jobs being created and better utilisation of assets. The state government gets the politics of building new infrastructure that pleases the voters. We all win. And the private sector gets the opportunity to invest in older assets, lift up quality. Now, everyone says, well, when you lease or sell an asset, you lose control of the asset. That's just not true. Everything comes down, because governments have two things going for them. One is you have the sale contract or the lease contract.
Yes.
And you can build into that certain protections to ensure the infrastructure is controlled. Also, importantly, protections to ensure the prices don't go up by, say, more than inflation. And that all affects the value of the asset sale price, but that's okay. The second thing you have is regulation. You can always regulate these assets. And that's the default, which other people selling assets don't have. So government has the capacity to be a legacy regulator of assets that it either leases or sells. So there's no public downside. And the upside is that with either your own money or private sector money, you can leverage it up to get so much more. The worst thing a government can have is lazy assets. It's like a business. And if you've got, there are people all over the world, and what we did was we went to the pension funds in Australia and said, we are giving the mums and dads of Australia the opportunity to own electricity assets, to own water assets, to own all these things that the governments currently own. You, through your pensions, are going to have the opportunity to get the benefit of owning those assets. And it all worked. It all worked.
Yes.
It's also important to note. It's also important to note that the $100 billion stimulus that was created through asset recycling became a stimulus for other infrastructure to be built.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, if we were building a railway, then that meant that others were going to develop new buildings, new infrastructure hubs,
it continues today, because I just heard last week that in New South Wales, the new extension of the art gallery was actually funded by Restart New South Wales, the fund that were, I don't know if it's coming from the WestConnex sale of the shares or from other divested assets, but even if the program of the 15% incentive is now over, all this, I mean, it started really this cycle of like, I would say like a very virtuous cycle where it's just starting this really
Momentum.
yeah, a momentum which continues today in New South Wales with the really again the pipeline of projects is very, very important here, and some of them are continue to benefit from this asset recycling, and it's all the time very, very beneficial for the economy, and especially post-COVID. So that's something that are also studied by other governments to boost the economy. Of course, they need to have the regulation, they need to have, and there is different models. Some are using lease, as you just mentioned, or concession, or other type of long-term P3. I know that in the United States, it's more the P3 with brownfield assets, existing assets that are used, and so they give P3, and they have like an upfront payment for those P3 long lease. But whatever the contractual model, I mean, the mechanism is still the same, right? It's really to re-inject in new infrastructure some funding, some revenue from existing assets productive of revenues. And that's a very...
And the first thing to do is for the government to do an audit of the asset it owns. Mm-hmm. Even the United States government doesn't know how many assets it owns.
Yes.
But in the case, for example, of one of the most famous airports in the world, which is JFK,
yes,
they took the basis of my model.
Mm-hmm.
They said, we will give you, Carlisle,
Mm-hmm.
the opportunity to build a new terminal.
Mm-hmm.
It's our concession to you, which is effectively leasing out the asset, leasing out the right,
Mm-hmm.
the value of running a terminal. And they have built the terminal in fast time, and it's the only way we're starting to get real upgrades in American airports. But most American governments, the irony is that almost every airport in America is government owned. Mm-hmm. For a nation that doesn't mind the private sector owning the planes that fly, owning food companies, owning housing, owning hospitals, owning schools, somehow they thought, oh my God, you can't have you can only have the government or a government own an airport. And an airport is basically a fuel station with an attached supermarket. That's what an airport is. And now they're starting to realise that they've got about $1 trillion of assets in airports in America. And they're essentially lazy. That's why American airports are so poor compared to some European airports, for example, or many others around the world. And so now they're looking at how they can actually take the embedded value of those airports and use the money to actually upgrade the airports. Because at the end of the day, the private sector is worried about taking construction risk on a greenfield site. So the government can use its own balance sheet, its own capacity to underwrite all of that infrastructure risk.
Yes.
And it can do so by either putting seed money in or by removing the regulatory risk. And asset recycling facilitates all of that.
I know that's very interesting. And back to WestConnex, the sale of the shares, they actually waited, they sold the first half of it, and they waited for the construction to be completed to sell the rest, to have a better price in the market, and to take off the construction risk out of so to have a better value, I would say, of those sales. But yeah.
Well, WestConnex is a very good example. So when the New South Wales government came to me, they were building the first stage of WestConnex, not stage 2 or stage 3. I said I need cranes over the city. And at one stage, Sydney had the most number of cranes of any city in the world. And I said I needed tunnel boring machines and cranes over the city. And what they said to me was in the tunnels for WestConnex stage 1, when the tunnelling had finished, they don't dismantle those huge tunnelling machines. They just bury them underground. They turn them away and they bury them underground because it's costs too much and there's no replacement, value, right? So they actually, that's what they do. I said, well, how do we keep those massive tunnelling machines going and build WestConnex Stage 2 and WestConnex Stage 3? And they said, well, we have a financing issue. So I came up with mezzanine financing options and some grant options. So they would build Stage 2 and Stage 3 and then sell Stage 1 to pay for it.
Yeah,
that's how we made WestConnex happen. Yeah. And then at the end of it, I built an airport, Badgerys Creek Airport, which is a new 24-hour international airport. First time, Sydney's been talking about it since 1930. We finally got on with building it because we knew that we were getting the railway out there, we were getting the cars out there, people were moving out there. We needed to get the fuel line out there, and then you got the new 24-hour international airport.
And also the Sydney Metro, which is one of the major projects today in Sydney.
Yep.
And some of the money is also coming from those asset divestment back. So it's really shaping today Sydney new, I would say, infrastructure, connection, transport, all coming from those ideas of really recycling money into the infrastructure. Maybe a last point that I'd like to ask is India is taking the new G20 presidency and the GA Hub is very involved in those discussions right now. And India just published 1 year ago a very big program on identification of a pipeline of projects at state level and at federal level, but at state level because, and they published also a methodology of asset monetization. They call that asset modernization. And in that program, they actually have a whole chapter about Australia and inspired from the Australian model. So I think India will try to also, they have a lot of asset monetization already from highways and other, but that's really, they are going to scale up and also to attract more private investment in their infrastructure because there's a lot of huge needs in India. And so just say it's inspiring. You've been inspiring for a lot of countries.
So I mean, there's only two takeaways that matter. Number one is how do you deal with the politics of leasing assets and putting the money back in?
Yes.
And people will always back it if they think they are getting something new.
Yes.
They'll always, if you're offering them a new car, they're prepared to get rid of the old car. They might be unhappy about it from time to time, but they'll see the new car and they'll go, great. And by the way, they don't lose the old car, it's still there. And then the second thing is governments have run out of money.
Yes.
In this world, governments are now shrinking their balance sheets.
Yes.
If central banks are shrinking the amount of money in the world economy, we have to be innovative about where we find the money. And governments can no longer afford to have lazy assets. And then the third thing, the final thing, is give power to the people, to the government that actually is responsible for building it.
Yes.
Not many federal governments, not many national governments actually are responsible for the individual construction projects.
That's right.
And so what you've got to do is provide financial and political incentives for local government to make the hard decisions, because at the end of the day, they're probably the only ones that can ever build a lot of these things.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And
Thank you
so much for your very valuable insights.